You are listening to What the Flood, brought to you by Aon Edge, flood insurance that works for you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to What the Flood podcast. My name is Lauren Hanch, and I'm part of the Aon Edge sales team. And today we are going to be talking to Larry Mitchell, who's also part of the Aon Edge sales team and takes care of the western side of the country, the West Coast, otherwise known as the best coast, according to him. Right, Larry?
That's right, but you know what? Nobody can beat the beast coast that you work in, Lauren.
We'll see. We'll see. As the months go on, we'll see what happens. So how's everything going in California these days?
Well, things are going very well. You know, it's we got some clouds here, which is nice in California. Maybe we'll get a little bit of rain, but you know, as this podcast is going to talk about today, rain is great, but after a fire, it can be devastating.
That's right. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about something that a lot of people, especially outside of the western side of the country, don't really realize is that wildfires in California and some of those other western states really lead to a higher flood rate more in the winter months. What we think are the winter months is really their flood months. It's a little bit different for us over here on the East Coast because we really look out for the hurricanes and things. But for California and the other western states, the wildfires is really the big issue for them over there. 2020 was a bit of a mess in every way possible. We had a lot of hurricanes, we had a pandemic, and on top of that, we had a very, very active wildfire season. Larry, can you talk a little bit about how wildfires were affecting California during last year?
Yeah, it was crazy here on the West Coast. Anything basically from the Rockies and west, we just had the worst fire season in recorded history. We had over 40 large fires. Ended up being about 10 million acres burned. And this is in every Western state. We had massive amounts of wildfires. And just to give you a little bit of context, it was over 14,000 buildings that were destroyed and almost $3 billion in damages. It was a really devastating year for us.
Yeah, that's almost more than what the damage we saw from the very active hurricane season that we had this year too. So, let's talk about a little bit about, because most people probably don't understand, why does a flood even happen after a wildfire? What goes on during and after a wildfire that would lead to extreme flooding?
Yeah, good question. This is something I learned once I started looking a little bit deeper. I mean, I've been in the insurance business for 25 years, specifically in flood for just about 10 years now. And I always heard that, yeah, after a wildfire, it increases flooding, but I really never knew why until we really dove into this. And I started looking at some of the research you did, Lauren. Very interesting. What happens when there's a severe wildfire is that not only does it burn off all the vegetation that naturally absorbs and controls water flow, but it also melts the soil, the chemicals and the materials and minerals in the soil. It actually melts them and creates like a waxy type surface. So when you get even a small amount of rain, like 1 or 2 inches, it can cause devastating, fast-moving fires. And especially when, some fires happen. Unfortunately, Montecito was the worst example that we've had in recent history, where the Thomas fire, was still burning in the eastern part of Santa Barbara and Ventura counties when the rain was coming in from the west. So, all the emergency professionals from those communities did not have time to get in and clean up all the waterways. So we just created a massive amount of mud, rock, and water flow that completely inundated Montecito, and sadly had a significant loss of property and life.
Yeah, I mean, look, all I really see from these wildfires over the last couple, or I shouldn't say last couple months, but at the end of 2020 was the news coverage from it. To me, it seems year over year that wildfires just are increasing out on the West Coast. Do you think that's a true statement? I know you've been out there for a while, so do you feel like the wildfires have been going up every year?
No doubt, not just anecdotally from my particular perspective, but also, scientifically and historically. If you look at the models, um, not only is it getting warmer and are there more fires, but moisture is less in a lot of our communities. So, from the difference in damage just in the last 15 years is dramatic. We've gone from under, a half of $1 billion in damages up to over $1 billion in damages. This is year over year. It's a continual trend of increase in losses, fires. And, we don't get into whether it's, we don't get into political debate, whether, it's global warming or whatnot. All we know is historically, fires are increasing and flooding is increasing. There's
So since
no
we're going
doubt.
to since we have a lot of agents and brokers listening to this podcast, I think that you have a little trick to know what the difference is for things covered on a flood policy when it comes to wildfires, with regard to Mudflow or Mudslide.
Good question, yeah. So, anytime after wildfire, really for any flooding event, of course, flowing water, overflowing inundation of water is covered, and mud flow is covered. Now, not mudslide, and a lot of people get confused with that, Lauren. So, one of the better analogies I've heard about it is chocolate shake is covered, but not chocolate cake. So if it's flowing, if it's moving, then that's going to be covered with a flood policy. As none of these types of events are covered if you don't have flood insurance. Normal homeowners policies, cover, water damage from bursting pipes and those things, backup of sewers, but certainly
Right.
not water flow. So chocolate cake, it's moving. Chocolate shake, it's moving. Chocolate cake is not. That's when it just sort of, slides down. So, it's pretty easy for a claims professional to determine that, but for some of us, some of us lay people, it's not. But think of it this way, Lauren, if it's raining for 40 days and 40 nights, then the sun comes out, the birds are chirping, and all of a sudden the side of a hill comes down, that's definitely mudslide, not mudflow.
Right. And so that's not going to be covered. The mudslide is not something that's covered on a flood policy. Is there coverage out there for that kind of a situation? Is that typically covered on a homeowner policy?
That is not covered on a homeowner's policy. And quite frankly, landslide, mudslide, very, very hard to find. Sometimes if you search high and low, you can get, a difference in conditions policy, but quite frankly, they're pretty hard to find, especially anywhere where the risk is.
So even an earthquake policy doesn't cover something to that degree.
No, does not cover it. So now if there's an earthquake and it happens concurrently with an earthquake, then that would be covered under a earthquake policy.
So I like that analogy that you use. The chocolate shake is covered because it's I guess if you think of a chocolate shake, it's a little bit more liquidy than obviously a chocolate cake. So keep that in mind, folks, when you're writing flood, especially on the West Coast, and what's going to be covered, what isn't. I'm sure a lot of your insureds had that same question.
Yes, they do. And I sure hope I didn't, destroy anybody's dessert, when they're having thinking about landslide or mudslide. But yeah, that's a great little analogy to remember it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I always need those little tidbits to help me remember, because if you've ever read a flood policy or the actual form, the policy booklet, it is not light reading to say the least. So by the time you get to that page, you may be snoozing away.
Yeah, they are a little bit complicated. Nothing against, our attorney friends, but yeah, they're written by lawyers, sometimes a little bit hard to decipher.
Yeah. So I know I was doing some research about wildfires for this podcast. We also had a Learn in 10 webinar a couple of weeks ago, where I was doing some research, and I learned so much. But also, there are just so many resources out there to help agents pinpoint the risk and help their customers figure out what kind of policies they need. Do you know of what, like, some of the best resources out there that agents can use?
Yeah, great point. One of the better resources, especially directly after a fire, one thing I learned through this process and actually, in the flood industry in the last few years is after a major wildfire, then the USGS, United States Geological Survey, comes in along with FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, and they actually remap wildfire areas because it changes the flood risk in the flood zones. So USGS.gov has some great resources for looking at the maps after a wildfire. Of course, FEMA has a great toolkit to help you out to make sure that you try and protect your property the best you can after a fire, protect it from flood. So you don't get hit with the double whammy, of a severe fire in your area and then severe floods afterwards. Of course, none of those can, protect you 100% against Mother Nature, I live in California, so I hear so often, Lauren, oh, we're in California, we're in a drought, we don't get floods. But the fact is that we're nothing, and most of the Western United States are nothing but mountains and valleys are floodplain.
That's right.
Yeah, there's floodplains everywhere, and we've done a great job to, build dams and levees and drainage and all those things. But as we know, Mother Nature can knock it all down with a flick of a finger.
Yeah, there was a big flood back in the 1800s, right? Speaking of raining for 40 days and 40 nights, I think it was a pretty similar situation, right?
Oh yeah, that was the Great Flood of 1862 you're talking about. And yeah, that was a series of what we call Pineapple Express storms, and very warm storms coming in after historically, significant snow seasons. And we had like 3 or 4 back in that day. We had 3 or 4 really, high seasonal flood totals because of the snow accumulation. So what happened is we had all this snow. It rained significantly for many weeks. And to make a long story short, basically there was flooding all the way from the Columbia River up in Portland all the way down to Bakersfield and beyond. So we didn't have all the flood and damage control we have now, and it was bad. In fact, in Sacramento, the legislators had to go to work in rowboats at the state capitol until they
Wow.
relocated to San Francisco, and they actually raised the entire city of Sacramento 10 feet. That's how severe the Great Flood of 1862 was. And the scary thing, Lauren, is it could happen again if we have, several years of significant snow followed by some Pineapple Expresses. So, in fact, scientists think these things happen about once every 200 years. And that was 1862. So, God forbid, we don't want that to happen again, but we do want to be as diligent as we can in protecting, our property. And of course, flood insurance is one way where people can make sure if the worst does happen, then they have coverage to, rebuild.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, why is it called a Pineapple Express?
Because it comes from the tropics, it comes up from the south. So a lot of storms that come from and hit the West Coast, they come from the north, Alaska, they're cold. But when they come up from the south and from the tropics, they're called Pineapple Expresses because it's warm water. And when warm rain hits melted snow, it creates devastating floods.
Interesting. Yeah, the only thing I think of when I hear Pineapple Express is that movie. I think like Owen Wilson was in it a while ago. It was about the train, I think. All right,
Yeah.
Larry. Well, thank you for spending some time with me today and letting our listeners know about wildfires and how it could affect their flooding risk. I'm going to actually link Larry's contact information in the show notes on this podcast. So if you're interested in reaching out to him for more information on our products or to talk a little bit more about wildfires, I'm sure he's happy to talk to you. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you, Lauren.
Thank you for listening to What the Flood podcast, brought to you by Aon Edge. For more information about our programs, please visit aonedge.com. For questions, please email us at edgefeedback@aon.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.